Hi there, it's Neil Christiansen, and welcome back to another episode of the Mile High Market Talk podcast, where we bring local professionals to the stage so that they can share their expertise and educate those who are looking to build their overall wealth. In today's episode, we're going to learn how to turn an Airbnb into a profit powerhouse. When owning property and using it as an investment, it can seem simple to operate and to make it a profitable asset. However, it never hurts to have a coach or someone who has achieved success and has systems to support one's journey in the short-term rental space. So whether you're just starting out or already have numerous investment properties, you'll be able to work smarter and maximize your revenue after listening to this episode. I'd like to introduce our local guest today, Sabrina Calnan with bnbExcellent. Sabrina is a short-term rental nerd. She loves numbers. Being a previous investment banker, she brings that experience when evaluating pro formas and profit and loss statements. So if you're just starting out with your short-term rental quest or have been in the game for some time, today's podcast will offer tips and strategies to help you better prepare for that rental investment experience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sabrina. Hello, Sabrina.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think this is going to be a great talk today because Airbnbs were very popular when COVID hit. And it seemed to be quite easy to be profitable. Those that really had no experience were able to buy a property, put it up on the market, and rent it out for several thousands of dollars. And a lot of people saw that to be their friend was doing it. Well, why can't I do it? They were doing it. Fast forward to 2025, it seems like the market has changed, and those who were not necessarily prepared financially might be experiencing some hardship. So I'm just really excited for this talk today, Sabrina. Let's go ahead and start with the first question is, what inspired you to establish bnbExcellent on the short-term rental consulting side of things?
Yeah, so, like you said, I kind of came from the investment banking world originally. And from investment banking, I went into long-term property management. I started a property management firm, had that for several years, but around 2015 was when I started getting a ton of questions about Airbnb and short-term rental because it was all the buzz. And to me, I started seeing a lot of people make assumptions about it and how it would work and how much money they could make. And it inspired me to get out there and start educating people because I hate to see people just, people were banking their retirements and things like that on this new Airbnb thing. It doesn't make sense always. So I wanted to make sure people got the education that they needed in order to make good decisions financially with their short-term rentals. Because I'm one of those people who, I'll give you the straight answer, even if it's something you don't want to hear. And, my clients know me for that, and they trust me for that.
Right. Yeah. So do you think it's because rental real estate or just real estate in general, people just feel like they have like a good enough understanding to really just jump into it without, considering too much? With you being an investment banker at one point, I'm sure you kind of looked at a lot of scenarios and so forth that people put several hours in and maybe have spent several thousands of dollars to see if a idea within their business was going to work. Talk a little bit more about that counseling that you provide so that people kind of feel like this maybe isn't the best deal or situation I should partake in.
Yeah. So I think it's really important. I think what happens is people make a lot of assumptions. You hear Airbnb can feel like the next like get rich quick type of thing. And you can absolutely do really well with Airbnb. However, not every single property is a great Airbnb investment. First, we need to look at a few things. Number one, what are the rules and regulations
Mm,
in your area?
that's changed a lot.
Yes, it has changed a lot. And, most of Denver Metro um, has a restriction for primary residence, which means the home needs to be your primary residence in order to rent it out as a short-term rental. So, in Denver, in lots of Denver Metro, you're just not able to have a full house property that's rented out 100% of the time through
Hmm.
Airbnb. Now, there are exceptions to that. Arvada, Wheat Ridge, parts in Douglas County, are much more lenient with that. Also, I think you and I had talked about it before. The mountains are a whole different ballgame, and there's increasing regulations there. So regulations are kind of the first thing that we like to look at. And then I like to look at market fundamentals. What's the demand in that area? How many people are traveling there? What's the seasonality to it? And the thing about short-term rental is that it changes very, very quickly. So, if you're familiar with the space, you might hear a lot about market saturation. Once someone finds out you could make money in an area, a ton of other hosts come in. It increases the supply and therefore reduces the amount of money that each property can earn.
Hmm.
So I really like to look at markets where the market fundamentals are good, not necessarily, it's been rated top 10 for Airbnb investments.
Hmm.
And then after that, it's a process of number one, setting your property up for success to attract the travelers that are coming to the area. Number two, using the platforms like Airbnb and Verbo to make sure that you're ranking high in the search results. We have 3,500 in Denver proper alone. So if you aren't
35.
at 3,500 Airbnbs in Denver proper alone. So if you aren't, in the top of those search results, you're just not getting bookings. So you have to learn to do that. And a big piece of that puzzle, after you make sure you understand how to use like the algorithm on Airbnb and Verbo, is then using pricing as a lever because people are not just real estate investors. I think that's a big misconception when you're an Airbnb host. You're in the hospitality business, you're in the travel industry, and we all know that the airlines and the hotels, their prices change daily. And so as an Airbnb host, you want to do the same thing in order to maximize your income.
Mm, interesting. Wow. I mean, that's just some of the 3, 4, 5 minutes that we just discussed there. I'm sure there's probably so many people that are currently in Airbnbs or have purchased Airbnbs, properties that have turned into Airbnbs, probably didn't know any of that stuff. And like you said, two good examples of market saturation. Just look at Florida, just look at Arizona. I mean, these are two places that have experienced a significant amount of growth in those Airbnb and VRBOs, but now people are freaking out because they can't, like you say, rent them. They probably didn't anticipate that they would maybe have to come to the table to support some of those payments and so forth. So hearing just what you said, it seems like people really need to kind of take this more serious than they've ever had if they really want to make this a good investment.
Yes, exactly. I think, they're gone are the days where you could just throw something up and make a ton of money. Way back in 2015, it was like that because there were so few rentals. We had sort of that boom time, like you mentioned. It's sort of between 2020 after COVID opened up and 2022 where rates were super high. We had that revenge travel going on. And now the
Hmm.
market is settling in a little bit. But again, the short term rental market, people fall in and out of it really quickly. And so it just changes constantly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you really need to take it seriously. This is it can be a very big opportunity, but also it can lead to a very big expense if you don't prepare accordingly. So great info on that. Question number two is: what common challenges do Airbnb hosts face in maximizing their bookings? You kind of talked about that briefly, and how does bnbExcellent assist in overcoming these?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of really common challenges. I think people get out, they start hosting. Hosting can be really easy, assuming you have the good systems in place and things like that, and just sort of look at it from a lens of hospitality. But what people forget about is pricing. And a lot of people are just guessing with pricing.
Hmm.
Or
Yep.
they put into place a pricing tool like Airbnb Smart Pricing or Price Labs is a very popular one, and they expect that tool to do it right and do all the work. But the truth of that is the tools are great to have and they are absolutely necessary, but you as the host, you need to create the strategy that goes into the way that tool works. It depends on you, and it depends on you knowing your property, how it compares to other properties in the area, and your really hyper local market, because that's how travel works.
Hmm.
So I think that's one of the biggest pieces that a lot of people, they sort of just, I don't know, kind of like blindly feel their way through the process. They know they need some sort of pricing, they need dynamic pricing, but they don't exactly know how to do it. And doing that correctly can make a huge difference.
So those tools that you mentioned kind of helps with that, but again, if you're not familiar with the area, and again, I see this as everything when it's going up, it's easy, right? But when it starts to get more competitive, less and less people are, let's say, traveling to utilize the Airbnbs and so forth. How does one? So you said these tools, but like really, how do they start to understand price? And like you say, maybe it's just guessing, and they're just lowering, lowering, lowering until they finally find something. But is that kind of the extent of it, or is there some rhyme behind that?
Yeah, there's definitely rhyme and reason behind it. I always say it's a little bit of an art and a science, just like, real estate
Mm,
sales. When you're
mm,
comping out a property and determining how much you're going to sell it for, there are so many unique factors that go into play. And it's the same thing with any sort of vacation rental as well. So there are, I always recommend doing data research and some market research. There are tools out there to do that. There's brute force ways to do that within just Airbnb as well. But it's really important to understand certain metrics like, what is your booking lead time? That means how far in advance do people book? What is the average length of stay in your area? And that depends on why people are traveling to your area. And then understanding what the average rates that your competitors are charging. And there's a couple of vanity, I call them vanity metrics. It's, the biggest one I hear about is occupancy. People feel like if they have a fully booked calendar, they're doing really well. But the thing is, like anybody can have a fully booked calendar if they're charging $1 per night,
right.
to make it extreme. And what you really want is you want a calendar where you have the highest nightly rate and the highest occupancy so that your overall income is as high as it can possibly be.
Mhm. Mhm. So just because you've got 30 days booked, and like you said, if you're charging something extremely low, sure, you're also probably going to bring in people that you may not want to have stay at your place. But what you're saying is that it's better to maybe have 10 to 15 days booked within a month, but at the right price to where you're actually making a profit.
Absolutely. It's not always about having that calendar completely filled. And this is another misconception that I hear a lot is people feel like if they aren't getting the bookings, they do need to consistently lower their price in order to increase bookings. But there are so many other levers that people can pull other than lowering the price as far as settings within their listings, what's your minimum length of stay, the way your listing is marketed, just utilizing all of the features within Airbnb and Verbo, and doing some changes according to what the market looks like. I'd always tell people you should reevaluate your market at least once or twice a year and make adjustments accordingly.
Hmm. Well, that's interesting because just like what you said there, people, I mean, this could just be the episode tip right here is you probably see people reduce their price. Then they get to a place where they're like, if I drop it one more dollar, I'm actually now having to come to the table, right, to support
Mhm.
my mortgage and so forth. Then they start to probably go down that rabbit hole to go, you know what, this doesn't make sense. I just probably need to sell it. Then they put it, as you said, market saturation. If everybody else is selling because they don't understand some of these other tips that you just suggested, now they might just be losing out on a probably a good property and a good investment idea or investment, but not understanding how to make adjustments, kind of talking themselves out of it. So, I mean, I think just those tips right there could be the episode just because people can say, all right, let's take a step back. I might have to be a little bit light this month, but with these other ideas and so forth on how I can actually start to get some bookings, they all of a sudden start filling up their place.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the problem is when you get too low in price, you also attract a guest that maybe is not the best
Yeah.
guest. They're either very picky, they may damage the property, things like that. So what we don't want is a race to the bottom. And I've talked a lot about like the numbers and price, but part of being a successful host is being really strong in the hospitality side of things. And these platforms are watching, they know how quickly you respond to people. They are reading the reviews, things like that. And the better host you are, also the higher you're going to rank in the search results as well. So it's
Very
it's
good.
kind of a double-edged sword there where you want to make sure you're hitting both sides of the hosting process.
And you said earlier that hosting isn't necessarily hard, but I think when these challenges come to that host that they're not familiar with or how to, adapt to, they might become like a bad host just by default.
Yeah, I don't no one goes into the business saying, "I really just want to make as much money as possible and I don't care about the people staying in my
Right.
home."
Right.
Nobody does that. But what happens is maybe they haven't prepared enough or, utilize the tools that can really help enhance hospitality. And there are a lot of like automation tools out there that can make hospitality so much better. And they start to have one bad experience or another, and these sort of just build on themselves. So I always tell people it's really important to get set up appropriately for success, because that creates your anchor that you have on these listing platforms. And it's
Mhm.
hard to dig yourself out of the hole. Whereas if you start out right, you do really well.
We've kind of talked about a few of them, but what trends should hosts be aware of to stay competitive in the evolving short-term rental market? And then how can they adapt?
Yeah. So, I think some of the trends, number one, we talked about rules and regulations, and you mentioned like the Florida and the Arizona markets, which is sort of interesting. Florida has very few regulations around vacation rentals, and that's why there's so much saturation there. So, I'm actually a fan of rules and regulations because it does control the saturation in the market a little bit. But you want to be aware, because you can purchase a property and they will change those rules and regulations on you after you've made that purchase.
Right,
And they
right.
rarely grandfather anybody in. Second, like I said, you want to check your market at least once or twice a year where you just do a full market analysis. Because some of these metrics that you're going to be using to make your settings and to establish your prices, these change over time. And especially, we can take right now as an example, we've sort of had this up and down with tariffs. International travel is down,
Hmm.
whereas domestic travel is just fine. So if you're in an area with a lot of international travel, you might be hit a little bit harder. You sort of need to change your marketing in order to attract more domestic travelers.
Okay. Okay.
So that's one trend that we're seeing. I spoke to a woman who's located in a luxury market in La Jolla, and most of her travelers were international travelers, and she's seen just a big dip in bookings coming in. So now we're
Hmm.
looking at like really targeting her market, really targeting those travelers domestically,
Yes.
a little bit better than she was before.
Hmm.
And like I said, those other metrics like your lengths of stay could change, the average rates that people are charging could change, how far in advance people can change, all part of the strategy.
Well, I mean, if you're going to get into this as a business, because it is, you got to treat it like a business. And like you said, when people kind of get comfortable with what was working, as you have said numerous times, I mean, markets change all the time. I have been in this business for almost 3 decades, and I can tell you that the mortgage interest rates don't stay the same every single day. So you have to make sure that you have a system and you have good marketing ideas and so forth, so that you can attract different folks and so forth. Because I think that's where a lot of people just get frustrated and think that their Airbnb or their investment is no longer, working.
Yeah, agreed, agreed. And a lot of people, I think if they doubled down and just worked on some of these processes, they could do very well.
Yeah. All right. So I know you probably have a good story, maybe even a bad story. Can you share one of them at this point?
Yeah. I mean, I can share a great story. I had a client who they were hosting a townhome, and we, pulled up like the estimated revenue for that townhome based on the properties that were around and things like that. And he just went all out. He made the property beautiful with design. We got great pictures of the property. He was a great host. We really doubled down on doing the pricing well for him. And, as I mentioned, a lot of people use a pricing tool. So if you're using a pricing tool, you don't really have a leap above other people. You have to use that pricing tool correctly. And for the first 2 years, he beat the market by double because he did so well.
By utilizing that tool or?
Yes, all of those factors that I mentioned,
Okay. Okay.
he put together a great property. It wasn't larger than other properties, didn't have amazing amenities or anything like that, but it just looked nice, was marketed well on the platform. He was a great host as far as being really responsive to people, making sure they had what they needed, and then we did the pricing for him, and all of those factors combined just allowed him to beat the market.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
So you got a bad story to share?
Yeah, I mean, the rules and regulations get people a lot of times. I had a client he'd really done the right thing. He'd called the city. He had He has a property that is an up-down, well, the city is calling it an up-down multi-unit now, but he, for him, when he initially got his license from the city, he talked to them and it was like the bottom unit was more of it was not considered a multi-unit, it was like more of a secondary type unit, which he was allowed to rent because it was all one property and part of his primary residence. Well, lo and behold, he's successful host for like a couple of years, and the city comes back to him one day and says, actually, you can't do this because we're considering this a multi-unit. The one that you live in is your primary residence, and the other one is another unit altogether. And that happens. And it comes in waves with the city of Denver. They seem to be doing a little bit of that right now as well. I've heard several people who have called me and asked what's going on. So, those regulations will get you.
They will. I mean, and like you say, you got to be on top of them and hope that they, don't, they're not created to push people out of these type of business opportunities. Because isn't it true that if you're an Airbnb or if you own property and you're using it short-term rental, are your property taxes based off of it being commercial, or is it still residential?
It's still residential right now. They have tried many a time to make that a commercial tax,
Okay.
which is huge. It's 4 times what it is for residential.
Mhm.
And I'm very big on advocacy. I'm a part of the Mile High Host, which is Denver's short-term rental association. And that was one of the big successes we had as an association is we all went down to the county building and made testimonials as to why this commercial tax doesn't necessarily make sense here in
Mhm.
Colorado.
Mhm. And they obviously have not put
They
that
have
into
not passed
play.
it, but yeah, it had come up several times before that, has not come up again, that particular tax. They've looked at different ways to tax. The most recent one was a bill that was to increase taxes on both hotels and lodging tax for vacation rentals, which was something that we had more of a neutral stance on because it was not singling out individual short-term rental hosts. An overall increase might make sense, but so yeah, there's always things going on. It's something people need to stay on top of.
Absolutely. Before we wrap this up, I just have another quick question. I'm curious by this. So, the people that you come in contact with, are they utilizing this idea to help build retirement and supplement their retirement down the road, or are they just purely into kind of having some fun with it, being a fun host, and then eventually just selling and kind of moving on? What do you typically see?
Yeah, so what I see, most people have some ambitions with regards to the extra income that they earn from the rentals, and a lot of times it is like I'm starting with one property. I really want to do well with this. Then I can build a portfolio, and this will help me, in my retirement days, pay for my children's school, things like that. I can tell you, my husband and I, personal experience, we started out with our carriage house in the back of our home, and I was working like a dog back then when we were doing it, and my time has really opened up to the point where, I'm able to pick up my daughter from school every single day now, and I've been able to do that for, like, the last 5 years, and things like that are really the greatest rewards that people get from being a
Mhm.
short-term rental host, and people are looking for rewards like that.
So, not just the investment and the idea of making money, but having that freedom, the free time, spending more time with the family. That's also a reason that people get into this side of business.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And I was going to ask, can the host review the person that stayed with them?
Yes, yeah, so it's a reciprocal review system on both Airbnb and Vrbo where the host reviews the guest and vice versa.
Okay. Okay. So that encourages both people to be on their best behavior then.
Exactly, keeps people honest,
Right.
and I've been doing this for over 10 years. We've had maybe and I've worked with up to 40 properties at a time. We've had maybe 1 or 2 poor experiences with guests, and nothing was super detrimental, but most of the time, it's a good experience for everybody.
Yeah. I think media tends to find the ones that are just absolutely, horrible for some hosts because people come in and trash their home and so forth. But I would agree. I think the overall, most people are experiencing great guests and people that are truly taking care of their properties.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a lot of fun, like you said, hosting can be a lot of fun. People come to your area, they're usually in a good mood, they're complimenting your space, they're enjoying your town, so I find it a lot of fun.
Great. Well, Sabrina, this conversation has been absolutely awesome. Where can people learn more about you and your services?
Yeah, you can visit my website at bnbExcellent.com. So that's BNB like Airbnb and then excellent with a T.com. And you can reach out to me from there.
Fantastic. Well, this has just been a great conversation. I hope everybody listening has enjoyed this, as well as, if you were thinking about getting into the short-term rental space, or maybe you've got several properties, it just seems like there's just been a ton of great tips and strategies to make your experience even better. So until next time, keep having a great day, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.